That might be one of the highest I've ever seen a 737 wing get during a landing. Here's the full video. The thing about landing a plane is that if you start off really bad, it gets harder and harder to make it work out really well. It's kind of like jumping. If you were to jump and you were to be off balance, it's hard to jump high. I mean, I personally can't jump high no matter what I'm doing, but if you're off balance, you're not going to be able to jump nearly as high than if you were to run up with your feet properly placed beneath you and jump up. That's obviously going to be the way you can jump the highest. If you're doing it when you're off balance and falling over, it's going to be a lot harder. It's the same thing when you're landing a plane. If you're off balance and your wings are going back and forth, it gets harder to properly land if you just start off wrong. You can see right here the plane is rocking back and forth even right as they get close to the runway to touch down. Pilots do that. I've done that before. But typically what you'll learn as you go through flight school, and it's something that happens to everybody, it still happens to me sometimes, when something is happening that you're not expecting to have happen. The last time this happened to me, I was in the simulator, a lot of things started breaking, and instead of properly trimming the aircraft and doing things so I was flying with my fingertips or using very little of my own personal strength, I had like this death grip on the yoke. And when you're doing that, you're now going to be more abrasive with your controls. And so when you're not as comfortable in your aircraft, you're going to be doing things like rocking the wings or pushing the nose over back and forth because you're trying to use your strength to do it instead of having the plane perfectly leveled and balanced out. Your hands should really never be tired when you're flying. You see right now how the wings are level? Everything is okay. There may be 70 feet or so off the ground, so they're on the correct descent path. But watch. You see how much of the right engine you can see? Also notice the tires. The right tire is a lot lower than left tire. This is less about perspective and more about the plane being in a bank to the right, which is a major concern this low to the ground. Now right here the wings are level again, but watch this. So in order to get back to the middle of the runway, you can see this left wing is down, the left tire is much lower, and look how much of that right wingtip you can see. When you go through flight school, when I went through flight school, a lot of times you get taught to learn it with the plane banked over like that because you're dealing with a certain level of crosswind and it's a little bit easier to do. However, when you start getting into commercial jets, you never want to see your plane landing not with the wheels touching down at the mains. You don't want to ever see those not touching down at the same time. Now, sometimes it happens, but on a commercial aircraft, you want to be typically landing with the wheels touching down at the same time. On a 737, I called a friend of mine just now to ask him how much bank you can have in there. He said it's somewhere between 10 to 12 degrees, depending on the model and the winglets and a few other factors. So he said, roughly 10 to 12 degrees, which is kind of a lot on a 747. You would definitely be hitting some engines if you were to go 12 degrees over. But on the 737s, you have a little bit more wiggle room as far as how much you can bank the plane. The other thing you'll notice is the descent rate to the runway. If there was a flare, it was extremely minor and definitely not enough. That descent, when you come in, when the plane flares, you see the nose go up in the air. What that does is it slows down the rate of descent of the plane coming down to touch the runway. By doing that flare, the plane might go from doing 900, 1,000 feet per minute to 400, 450. Depends on the plane, depends on a lot of different factors, but it's going to slow down the descent rate a lot. But now they're descending, and because there's no flare, that pounds the left tire into the ground, bouncing it in the air. And since there was no impact on the right side of the plane, the momentum starts to shift over that direction. What can happen is with that left gear being the only one touching the ground, the entire weight of that aircraft is slamming that left tire or left main gear into the ground. And when you slam the entire weight of the aircraft onto that left gear, it's not structurally used to taking that level of weight, especially with the fast descent rate, and not sharing the weight with the other gears, which it was designed to do. So the combo of both those things, the fast descent rate and the fact that it's all on one gear, could have bottomed out the landing gear, causing it to bounce up in the air because it just goes all the way to metal on metal, or it compresses it so much that it just pushes back and can be one of the causes to let the plane go up in the air. You also saw the nose start going forward, so this can get really dangerous. You see here as the nose starts to drop, but then you see how high this wing comes up. I suspect this is not wind related. I think someone's actually doing that with the yoke. It is possible that the wind would do that, but it'd be very unlikely to have it go up that much if somebody was properly at the control. So that's why I think it was yoke related. Obviously there's not a windsock and you can see the trees are moving here, but it's really hard to tell the strength of the wind just by looking at these trees. Now these pilots could have done a go around, obviously. The plane was unstable, they were rocking back and forth, they weren't flaring, and they ended up hitting that left gear in first. So there was a lot of things that could have been reason to call an unstable approach and do a go around. Would have been totally fine to do that. They decided to make this landing work. That hard gear landing, okay, that's a bit of a problem. If the nose had gone over any further and the nose had hit the ground, that would have been a real problem. But it looks like they were able to get both the mains down before the nose touched down, which was cool. That having that left wing go up really high like that, that's very dangerous, because if you were to grab that runway or something like that at that speed, it would be very dangerous for everybody on the plane. Obviously, I don't know. I don't have any pictures to see, but I'm guessing they had some damage on that aircraft. And either way, they're probably going to need to have maintenance come and inspect the left gear because they slammed it in the ground so hard. In the US, when you have a hard landing like this, and trust me because I have done it before, typically what we do is we don't open the door and we just talk about what a terrible pilot I am and how I can do things better in the future. I haven't flown Ryanair except once and a very long time ago, and I think I went out the back of the plane, so I don't know if they normally stand up and greet people as they get off the plane like I typically do when I'm flying passengers, but that's definitely one that if I was up there, once you landed and parked at the gate, we'd be talking about how did that happen, what went wrong, and talk about everything so you can help that pilot get better. The rocking back and forth was an indication in the beginning like this was not set up correctly. Then the not flaring would obviously be a problem. Having the left gear hit the ground that hard is going to be a problem. So you see how these problems start compounding and becoming worse and worse and worse, and that just, you saw that at the very beginning when it started off with the rock back and forth like that. You typically don't want to see that from a pilot. That usually indicates they don't have the plane under control to the degree that they should. Obviously, there will be circumstances where you have to rock those wings because you're fighting such a gust. And from what I can see in the trees here, it just doesn't seem like a really strong crosswind that they're dealing with because of the way they're moving the wings back and forth. So having the wings rocking back and forth and landing on one tire and not flaring, those are all things that I've done. Most pilots have done that at some stage in their career. However, letting that wing get really high like that, that's where you have to kind of draw the line. That becomes a safety issue when you let a wing get that high, whether the pilot put in the wrong wing correction or they let the wind get under there or whatever it was. That's not something you should ever see. Kind of looking in that go around to see if they put the gear up, so that way when I forget to put the gear up on a go around I don't feel so bad about myself. So this is kind of similar to the Ryanair video, except they did a go around and you saw they had that little bounce there, but you saw the difference between landing on one tire really hard and landing on two tires really hard. This is a very firm landing and you can see the entire plane shake because they impacted so hard, but with both gear hitting, the jump up is not nearly as much in the air. The plane also didn't look like it flared until right before touchdown. You need to give the plane a little bit of time to actually slow down from that, let's say 900 feet a minute to the 450 feet a minute. You can't just instantly do it and it immediately stops. Typically, I start flaring, I don't know, about 40 feet or so. It's going to be different on every plane. If you do that in a small Cessna, you're going to be halfway down the runway, but on my plane about 40 feet off the ground is when I flare, and then I let off actually a little bit, but that slows the descent rate down before you touch down. If you flare too close to the ground, the plane just doesn't have time to slow down, and this is what happens. You see how low they are to the ground here as they flare? But the bounce up in the air is actually really small. The other side of that, of course, is if you flare too high in a commercial jet, which you typically don't see. And I keep waiting to see one of those videos because that's something I did in flight school. And when I would go from flying the 747 to flying a general aviation aircraft, that's something that my muscle memory wants me to flare much higher. I keep feeling like any minute now we're just going to slam this plane into the ground. So you'll see that more going from a bigger aircraft to a smaller aircraft. Those pilots want to flare early because they have that muscle memory of flaring 30 feet off the ground, and so your body's used to it. You typically go up in size in planes, so you don't have that issue. But when you go from a very tall plane, like a 747, where we're very high up in the air, to a plane that's 2 feet off the ground when you touch down, it's a very uncomfortable feeling. So you'll see those pilots flare kind of high, but you typically don't see it. A commercial aircraft fly too high because we have the audio countdown that we get where it tells you you're 50, 40, 30. When you hear that countdown, usually you use that with what you see out of the plane to kind of get everything to work. Now, these pilots obviously decided to do a go-around, but when they actually touched down the second time, it would have been fine. They actually wouldn't have needed to do a go-around here. Obviously, I don't know if they were too far to the left or the right of the runway, but it didn't look like they were making any corrections on the wings, and I don't know how far down the runway or how short on the runway. I can't really see that from that perspective, but you saw the wings, they vibrated as the plane hit the ground the first time because they hit kind of hard, but that second time, they kept the nose up, the gears touched down, the mains touched down by themselves together, nose still up in the air. That second landing would have been fine. They could have rolled that out and been fine, but always at the end of the day, they chose to take the safer option, execute the go-around, and go back up again. This EasyJet pilot, as you can see, keeping the nose up here is very different from the 737 from Ryan. They actually let the nose start to go down, and that starts to get dangerous as well because you can smash that nose in. This pilot on the EasyJet leaves his nose up in the air, so it really would have been fine. It would have been a hard landing, but for whatever reason, they went back up in the air to try again. Had that pilot flared maybe 10 or 15 or 20 feet earlier, that landing would have been great. Would have been no issue at all. And sometimes pilots make those landings firm on possible. Probably not that firm, but just a little bit less firm than that. And if you have like a wet runway or a contaminated runway with snow or ice, sometimes they'll do that. If you're landing on a very short runway, you'll do that because you're not trying to make it as smooth as possible, which sometimes can result in you floating down the runway a little bit, trying to grease it on. So sometimes the pilots will land firm, not so hard to bounce in the air, but sometimes a firm landing is done on purpose. And hopefully, if you have a really hard landing, when you look outside, it doesn't look like this where there's not a cloud in the sky, because then it's a lot harder to explain to your flight attendants that there was a puddle right as you were getting ready to land and you didn't want the plane to hydroplane on that puddle, so you put it in firm on purpose. It's harder when it's all blue skies. Ask me how I know. I look forward to hearing from you. Until then, keep the blue side up.